welcome to a special episode of Success Showcase, where we're going to be discussing grief and bereavement. This is part 2 of a podcast that started over on Lighting the Candle, A World That Works. So check out Lighting the Candle, our sister podcast on the Exvadio Podcast Network. Hello, and welcome to this special joint podcast of the Success Showcase and Lighting the Candle, A World That Works. I'm your host, Eric Lopkin, and with me, as always, is my Success Showcase co-host, Chip Janizewski, as well as the host of Lighting the Candle, A World That Works, Bill Carell, and co-host of Lighting the Candle, as well as host of Pets, People, Life and Longevity, Jen Jeremias. Welcome, everybody.
Hey, buddy.
Thanks.
Good to have everyone here. And what we are doing on this special episode, just to give our listeners a little background, at the end of 2023, Success Showcase did a series of podcasts talking about mental health and dealing with depression. And this is an outgrowth of that. We're going to be talking about grief and how we deal with death, our experiences with it. And of course, to facilitate this, we've brought in an expert. We have Kate Mollison, who's going to run this. Kate is a grief and bereavement specialist. So I will toss it over to you. Kate, take it away.
Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, so just to give the listeners a little bit of background around myself, I am a certified grief coach. I am a clinical case manager, and I have training and certification as a trauma play therapist. After my own experience with grief and loss when I was widowed in 2020, I turned that tragedy into a business endeavor where I realized there's a huge gap in services for people experiencing grief. So thank you for having me here today, and I'm really excited to facilitate this conversation with you all. And if you guys are ready, let's get started.
Yeah, it's great that we could have you here. And of course, one of the reasons that we've gathered this group together is that over the past year or two, every one of us has lost somebody, either a parent, a friend, in-laws. We've all had dealings with grief over the past 18 months or so.
Yeah, and grief is something that we as a culture and as a society aren't taught how to effectively manage. By that, I mean, we're taught that it is something that just we get over, we finish, we check it off the to-do list, and we're supposed to get back to normal. But the science behind grief says that there is no normal after that type of experience, that your body chemistry, your chromosomes, your cells are quite literally changed. And so we have to start changing the conversations we have about grief. And so first of all, I'd like to extend my deepest condolences to all of you in your losses. I know that it's not an easy thing to experience, and I want to thank you for your openness and willingness to participate in this conversation.
You're very welcome.
Absolutely. And
so I'd like to get started by just asking you guys to tell me the first word that comes to mind when someone says grief. What are some things that you think about, just rapid fire?
Sadness.
Sadness.
Loss.
Sadness was the same word I came up with.
What else do you have, Dan? Give me another one.
Okay, hold on a second.
We'll circle back. Bill, what were you going to say?
Despair.
Despair.
Emptiness, loneliness, sorrow. This sucks. I don't even know where it sucks from. It just sucks.
It does. Yeah, that's a pretty all-encompassing. Jan, did you think of something?
I have not.
Okay. Sometimes there's not a word for it, right? Like that's completely normal, and we struggle to articulate the breadth of what we're experiencing. But if we're thinking about grief and loss in that perspective in relation to ourselves and to the people that we've lost, why are we so afraid to talk about it as a culture? Why is it so difficult for us to speak out loud about it? What do you guys think?
Well, I think actually what you just said, why is it so difficult? It is a difficulty. I mean, when you're talking about it, it's very emotional. And it's tough to find the words to articulate what you're feeling. And also for a lot of us, we're sort of taught from a young age. It's like, well, this is part of life and you have to buck up and deal with it. And, that's not necessarily the best way to deal.
Sure.
I would say there's a cultural hand-me-down that's come from several generations that have dealt with a lot of loss, a lot of people who starved to death, a lot of people who froze to death in the cold, who went through genocidal circumstances and that sort of thing. And the Brits have always said it's best to keep a stiff upper lip and never let them know what you're thinking. Okay. So with that in mind, I can remember at an early age, fall down, get a little bit of notice from crying the first time from my mother. Then when my dad goes, wipe yourself up, wimp, get up and get back in the game. Let's go. So there's many different ways to get responses to the grief phenomenon, and just even describing what it is and how it feels is very difficult. There's actually not much language that comes to mind quickly in terms of identifying, as we said, what it actually is.
Two things that come to my mind, and one is Bill said something about the word thinking, about how, we're not taught, like people don't exactly know what to think about it, or they aren't willing to express it. And I think part of it is the fact that we're not a culture that really, as human beings, people don't show their emotions very easily. It's kind of like you're supposed to kind of create this wall, like you go to work and you're professional and your emotions aren't supposed to infiltrate that world at all. And it doesn't matter what you're going through. That was one thing that came to mind right away, is this feeling that, and I think especially being a woman and having worked in a very professional areas, women who were emotional were always perceived, I think, as being weak, and for a long time. And so I think that they don't want that weakness to show, especially in the professional world, because they feel like they'll be criticized or they'll be thought less than because of that. So I think that is some of it. I think also culturally, people don't like to think, even of their own death at all. Like it's something that in our culture is kind of, people don't want to go there. Like in other cultures, in Eastern philosophies or whatever, is they look at, I think someone once said to me, the day you're born is the day you begin to die. And it's very different in some of these cultures as their perception of death. And I think our perception of death is like this very negative thing and not a part of that life cycle.
Where do you think that stems from for us as a culture? And anybody can weigh in on that.
I think part of it is just the fear of the unknown. What is death? No one knows what's beyond the pale. But I've been studying Eastern philosophy for a while now, and there is a big difference between Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. And in the East, death is part of the journey. And it has to do with reincarnation and the next levels in our existence, where Western philosophy tends not to do that. And I think it's partially the Judeo-Christian upbringing, but it's a very different viewpoint. And I mean, even like one of the things that I recently studied was Kabbalah, and that's part of Judaism. And most people, if you ask about Judaism, do you believe in reincarnation? Oh no, reincarnation's not part of Judaism. Actually, it is. It's part of Kabbalah, but most people don't talk about it because we're ingrained in that Western Judeo-Christian ethic.
And some people get caught up in talking about religion, and they think that talking about death is very tied to religion. And so there may be that cultural disparity for us. as Westerners to avoid those conversations that not only make us emotionally uncomfortable, but make us politically and societally uncomfortable.
I was going to say before, there's a whole thing of politism as well. When you said politically, the first part of that is polite. So long and short of it is that people are uncomfortable talking about things that they're uncomfortable about, And so if you bring up something with somebody who doesn't feel like they have a strong answer or something to contribute. I can tell you the first 6 or 7 years that I was going to Catholic school, I didn't go for all those years, but I went to catechism on Saturday morning up until my teen years. I just got a little tired of Father Miller, who I absolutely loved, answering questions with, well, it's a mystery, my son. It was very unsatisfying, at that age to be looking at somebody who I would say, God, they're talking to God every day, and how can they not have a little bit more information for me? Are they not, like clued in on the code and stuff? I think they are, but what if they're not? What if nobody's got that code? Holy mackerel. Can't handle it.
I wonder if that's also part of why we don't talk more about it, is because we don't know. And so many of us you don't want to deal with stuff that you don't know about.
Yeah.
It's like you don't want to admit that you don't know. You don't want to say it's a mystery or, I don't know. So we just avoid the topic altogether.
It's a great point. And the fact of the matter is there is a lot of information out there that just goes undiscovered or untalked about. I think with grief, there comes a certain lack of curiosity, both as a griever and a grievee, someone supporting someone who's grieving, where we are so quick as a culture, like we've said previously, to fix it or to feel better or to get them back to normal, that we don't have that curiosity about why they're acting this way, whether it's grief or not. And we don't know where people are. You never know where someone is. The barista at the coffee shop didn't get your order right and was kind of crabby, and you just automatically assume they're a jerk. Well, for all you know, their dog died this morning. It really can be so integral into how we have those interpersonal communications and interactions with grief. And we as a global community post-COVID are experiencing grief in a way that the world has never experienced it before. So even more so now, it's important that we get curious and get empathetic and get introspective and start to think about grief in a broader spectrum. Anybody else have any feedback before we move on?
Yeah, now that we're getting into this, I'm thinking back, even though I've just lost my parents over the last couple of years, and both of them were pretty quick. I mean, I didn't have to go through any long things. But my first experience with death, I will never forget. I'm the oldest of 7, and I was in 7th grade, and it was the day we're going back to school after New Year's. And my brother Phil, who was a year younger than me, I think I was probably 12, 13 years old, he said, Mr. Redden, who was our next door neighbor and the father of 8, died last night. And I thought he was kidding me. I thought he was kidding me. And he sure enough had a heart attack. He woke up in the middle of the night, 40 years old, and was gone. And that was my first experience of death. His daughter was a classmate of mine. I never really knew her that well, but that was my first experience. Couple that with the fact that when I was 9 years old, moving into 4th grade, Bill, you got me by 3 months, by the way.
We'll cheer me and then we'll cheer you, okay?
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a large family still in Wisconsin, but since age 9, everything was out here. So the first time I lost a grandparent, I was in college, but I really never knew my grandmother that well because she was never out here. Lost other people that way. I think the one that hit me the hardest was my godfather, my Uncle Paul, who was the youngest in my mom's family, who was never sick a day in his life, and then all of a sudden got pancreatic cancer and was gone right before he turned 60. And he was a teacher at a school, and his funeral was like unbelievable. And that really hit me. But again, looking at my parents, me being the oldest of 7 and my youngest sister is just 10 and a half years behind me, I was always a loner. I mean, back in the 60s, and you know this, Bill, they'd open the door in the morning, we'd go outside and play, and they blow the whistle night. We come home after drinking out of the hose all day and eat dinner. And that's just the way. And so there wasn't a whole lot of emphasis put on things. I mean, my wife, when her parents passed away, they both spent some time in a nursing home before they left us, but they both lived into their 80s also. So it's, it's a different thing for everybody. But with me, I mean, I really haven't been that close with that. As I said, I have not lost a sibling. I've lost cousins out in Wisconsin who I really hardly ever knew. I've lost some friends and so on and so forth. And obviously losing my parents, it's, and looking at my own mortality. But again, I think I have things really in perspective as far as the way that I look at all of that. And fortunately, I have not been really exposed to the shocker of, that obviously a lot of you folks have been. So,
I'll share. So two things. I think my first experience of death was actually the loss of a pet. And in that way, I'm a pet person, as Eric mentioned, my podcast is Pets, People, Life and Longevity, all about life with a pet. And so that was probably my first experience, but also probably my greatest experience in having like something that I considered such a close friend, my cat, that had passed away. And I thought it would, in a lot of ways, especially as I moved into adulthood and had friends who had never experienced death before, losing anybody before they were in their 20s or older, I always thought, was a great thing to go through, to realize that everything is, every life is precious and every life is fragile, and so in that way, I think the most impactful death was a family member who committed suicide when I was in high school. And my father was an only child, and he was, a cousin of my father who was more like a brother to my father. And I think that was because I remember him per se, that the effect that it had on my father. And so I think that was probably one of the hardest losses, with someone who had taken their own life and, who had been in that much pain to actually not see any solution at all.
Yeah, that had to have been incredibly difficult, because in that instance, you're already wrapped up in ambiguity and the unknown. And then to take that component of the struggle that you can't even begin to wrap your head around that they were going through, it just compounds that feeling of hopelessness. And so I'm so sorry for that. You made a point about touching on pet loss, and I wanted to ask all of you about how you think we as a culture view grief when it comes to different losses. We're very quick to be sympathetic and empathetic when it's a child, a spouse, a family member, but do we get the same grief support or benefit when it's a friend, or not even a death grief, like your parents sold your childhood home, or a pet passes away, or you put a hole in your favorite sweater? And again, I don't mean to be glib, but if that is your only experience with loss, do we find that as a culture we lack that empathy for grief?
I think we do, especially with the smaller things, like you said, hole in the sweater, or selling the childhood home, especially since it's not something that everybody can identify with. When you lose a family member, well, either you've gone through it or you haven't. You either understand it or you don't. There really isn't a gray area there. But selling a childhood home, people move around so much now. It doesn't have the same impact that it did in generations past. So I think that's affected our ability to really empathize with things like that.
Good point. And then how do you think that affects our perspective to grief when we've had these experiences? How has it changed how you support people going through things?
The answer to that, I think, Kate, is it depends. And what I mean by that is that one of the things that I've discovered in my life, from an early age, in terms of being fairly decent as a student who could retain things, to being an athlete that could perform at different times, sometimes at my peak performance level, to being the same thing in terms of working for other people just by sheer hard work, being able to rise to the top of the leadership pyramid. But it was these things, these tools called distinctions along the way that actually were the levers of being powerful. And like, for instance, when you think about riding a bicycle, almost nobody ever talks about balance in terms of a distinction that you can talk about and
Equivocate.
equalize to other things, compare and say, balance is like, you look at a little baby who gets up and to walk and falls over. Almost nobody ever tells that baby, don't get up again. This doesn't get better. You're just going to keep falling down. Don't do it. No, that doesn't work that way. The distinction of balance has to do with the feedback getting from people around you. And there just haven't, for me, that I know of, been a lot of distinctions available in the area of loss and grief, and kind of getting over when things didn't work out, So that's kind of where I think that the wisdom of being able to take other strengths and distinctions that were very powerful in other areas, especially in the area of coaching other people in businesses and what have you, and utilize those in terms of trying to relate to what isn't working in my life, not like I want it gone, but where's the lesson here? What is it about this circumstance that is so unacceptable to me that I'm this upset over it? And how on earth can I just identify that it's me that's creating this right now and nothing else in the universe? And now that I've identified that that's possible, don't even have to believe it's true. If it's possible, what does that make available?
Yeah.
And so those are distinctions, where you don't have to solve something and get an answer that's like the truth. You only have to come back to a place of, or for me, this is what I'm sharing with you now, is for me, coming back to a place of responsibility allowed me to be in the middle of family mishigas over the last 2 to 3 years of people never agreeing about what's the right thing forward. And some people's response to that is to talk more loudly and faster than anybody else in the room, or to consume all the oxygen or whatever it is. I know none of you would ever have experienced any of that with your family members, but it does take some skill, and it takes a decision to rise above being part of that fray and take advantage of the skills that or that I have learned in other areas. And there might be some application here. Having a great life might just be having a great life. And so what if it is? What can I learn?
Such a great key word, the decision. It's a choice, right? And we also, as people experiencing grief, fall into a common, and we, the general greater good of the human race, fall into a pitfall of the victim mentality because it happened to us, whether it was anticipated or not. And it's very easy to just sit with that and ruminate on it instead of making the choice about figuring out where it resonates in your body, figuring out how to be present and how to practice mindfulness, figuring out what your previous experiences were with grief and how they shape how you interact with other people, figuring out that you're accountable to choosing happiness and choosing joy and moving forward. It has to be a choice. So I love that you brought that up, Bill. It's such an incredible, important point. I want to shift gears just slightly. We've been talking a lot about our past experiences and with grief in regards to other people, but I want to talk about grief and death and dying in terms of your own mortality. So commonly, when we experience grief, it causes us to question our own legacy, our own life, our own mortality. What is a fear that you have around dying or death? If you have one.
I'm not afraid of dying. I just don't want to be there when it happens.
Well, I hate to break it to you, Eric. I'm pretty sure there is if you figure out a way, you have a sellable thing there, you know?
It's actually a Woody Allen line that I stole, but
Yeah.
actually, my own death doesn't scare me because I grew up very sick, and for a long time, I did not expect to make it past 30. And now I'm in my mid 50s, and it's like, all right, you know what? When it comes, it comes.
Wow.
So having all of those years where I expected it, now it's like, okay, well, they were wrong about that. I'm still here. I've beaten the illnesses that they thought were going to get me. Now I've got new illnesses to beat. But, yeah, eventually I'll go. And at this point, I honestly think I'm going to fight it until a ripe old age.
Like it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not afraid either. I mean, to me, it's the transition thing. And over the last 20 years, I've gotten very much into personal development work. I mean, if you go back 20, 30, 40 years and so on and so forth, especially in the times that Bill and I were brought up in and so on, as far as, conservative this, conservative that, who cares what's going on with the world? It's there for us. We control everything and all this other kind of stuff. And if you look at me now versus where I was 20, 25 years ago, as far as environmentalism and everything else, I've shifted 1,000% because I now understand truly where we are and how we are all related. And it doesn't faze me. And I mean, my purpose in life right now is just to teach people that every single moment, I love Bill saying, me creating, that's what every single moment is. It's me creating whatever's going on. And that's all that we own. And I've dedicated, the rest of my life, my professional career now, to telling people that they do have that choice, the present moment choice, to choose positivity, to control it. I also preface it saying you're always going to have your ups and downs. So you're going to go through things, you're going to go through bereavement and everything else. But I mean, if I drop dead tomorrow, I know that I'm just transitioning, number one, and number two, just by being who I am and being the way that I am with other people, not for myself, but for them. There's a lot of people out there who have been positively affected because Chip was in this world, or Bill is in this world, or everybody else is in this world. And that's really what it's all about. It's not about flaunting it or anything like that. It's just being, me creating, just like you said.
Leaving the world a better place than how we found it.
Yeah, well, just for the present moment, the person you walk into. I mean, when I'm walking down the street, I'm waving to all the cars passing by and people walking by. And now that they know that I'm doing that, they're waving at me all the time too. That's just the way that it is. The Christmas Carol, Burl Lives, Have a Holly Jolly Christmas. The line, say hello to friends you know and everyone you meet. If you can do that one moment at a time, I don't care what that grocery clerk is going through or the person in the traffic car ahead of you and so on and so forth. But if you can be positive in that moment, they may not react positively, but for that moment, they're in your world and something good is happening to them too. That's just the way it is.
What an incredible ripple effect that has the potential to have. It very, that karmic balancing of the scales, if you will. And so I love that philosophy and that way of practicing life very presently.
Yep. Positivity, kindness is more contagious than any virus that's out there.
That's beautiful.
It is. Make it contagious.
So, Kate, I'm having a hard time mustering something other than an intellectual answer to an emotional question. With regard to how do I feel about my own passing, I don't actually know. And like Chip, we are habitual positive people because we've decided that's a great way to go through life. We don't have to remember that anymore, that we're already very articulate in the language of always being able to immediately get back to some sort of an upside. And then there are these times, I mean, and I've had 3 near-death experiences in my lifetime. So wow. I don't take this lightly at all. I really don't. And I also realize that my opinion about it at the end of the day isn't going to matter for a whit, What's going to happen is it's going to happen. And, intellectually, I get that. And at the same time, I also want to really concentrate on focusing. And as Chip said, when something happened that's really upsetting for you, and he said it kind of like, in a nonchalant sort of a way, just kind of get through it. And I thought to myself, some of the really hard ones are like being bareback on a stallion and bucking its brains out, trying to get you off of it. And about the only thing you can do to have this sense of survival, like any part of who yourself is, to exist and be stable through time. That's what I mean by that, is all you can do is hang on. And hanging on then becomes the work to do, not the understanding of it. That's for later. The reviewing the postmortem of what happened and how did it go down. And hopefully you'll be able to go through that at some point with somebody else. But the really courageous part is making that, again, a decision. I don't know where this is going to go, but I know I'm being dragged through the eye of a needle right at this moment, and it doesn't feel at all comfortable. And I would rather it just be over and quit and recede back to what I know I can't do. However, if I've stayed with it in the past and gone through the discomfort and really kind of talked myself through in terms of, again, it ain't happening to me. I am just having this dream about reality. And quite frankly, let's just see where it goes. And I think
Dan,
thinking about my own mortality I was just going to say, I think my own mortality is a little bit of that too, because there are times when I can get completely moved by the relationships that I am graced with to have with people in this world. And Chip, maybe not so much with you, but the other four folks on this call, I'm starting to get to be, at a level where I can't tell where one of us ends and the other one begins. And that's a good thing.
That's beautiful. And I apologize for interrupting you.
You didn't interrupt. You were contributing. Thank you.
Jan, I wanted to ask you, from a scientific perspective, since your background, you do have a history in science, do you find that we tend to want to understand what happens or that process in dying? I know you work a lot with the pets, and people, I'm sure, have questions about the science behind it. Do you find that people find comfort in that answer?
If anything, I haven't found that. I think people find much more comfort in the spiritual part of death. And those things like, if you believe in afterlife or reincarnation or, or even the fact that somebody's energy never dies. I think people find much more comfort in that than the scientific process of dying. And at least that's what I've experienced with like clients and everything around pet death and around clients that, who have lost, significant family members. That's much more, because I think that being the scientist and loving the fact that, there are certain things I love to understand. But I think when you're going through something so emotional, that's like almost like a Band-Aid fix. Like it's a temporary kind of Band-Aid that says, okay, well, now you know the reason. And eventually that reason kind of falls away and you still have all the emotional stuff and you're still looking for answers. So, and so I think that some of that just has to happen. It's like layers. Like I think it's all involved, but I don't think it's more important or makes, people feel that much better.
Yeah, it's almost like that goes back to that feeling of like the checklist or the accomplishment of death. Like you have accomplished death, of accomplished understanding it. And
right, I understand
away
death
from
now.
that.
Right, I understand death now. So basically I can get over it kind of attitude.
And then instead of getting comfortable with the uncomfortable and sitting with the ambiguous and sitting with the, the resonance of those unknowns and letting them just allow and having that curiosity and not looking for the fix, that's, I think, where people tend to spin their wheels and have maladaptive behaviors or unhealthy, grief experiences. With you guys thinking about your own mortality, how often do you think about death? How often do you think about dying for yourselves? Is that something that crosses your mind?
Well, I can say personally that a number of years ago, I got diagnosed with, let's say, a medical condition that basically was quite severe. So I think that, as retesting or monitoring comes up often, that it just reminds me that, of the frailty of life. I think my main focus is really, like I thought of Chip, is like, I think I focus much more on how can I make a difference while I'm here? Like that just seems to be where I go. I'm like, what impact can I have? Who can I help? How kind can I be? How can I move kindness into the world? And how can I ripple it out versus being preoccupied or thinking about my own, not being here in physical form.
Legacy.
I think about my legacy much more than I think about the actual fact that I wouldn't be here.
Eric, what about you? Do you think about your legacy or about your own death or mortality?
I don't think about it often. Again, because I have ongoing medical issues, I guess it's always sort of in the back of my head, but it's like, well, if I don't follow through on this, that's what's going to happen. So I better follow through. I think I actually posted on Facebook just a few days ago. At the end of your life, when your life passes before your eyes, make sure it's one worth watching. And I think that's really more of my focus. It's like, what am I doing while I'm here? Whatever's next will happen when it happens.
Yeah, it goes back to that legacy. And again, I think we as Westerners struggle with that word because it almost feels arrogant when we talk about leaving a legacy and making a stamp and leaving something behind. It gets misconstrued as, having a statue erected in our honor because we made a choice or did a thing that was so, earth shattering and ground shaking. But really it just comes down to, what's the ripple in the pond? I think about my late husband and I still, 3 years later get approached by strangers like, you're Craig's widow. Oh my gosh. Like, I have to tell you. And they'll tell me an anecdote about him that I didn't know. And it's so incredible to see the smile on their face and the light in their eyes because they knew him. And he had no idea that he was going to leave behind such an incredible amassed legacy. So I love, Chip, you're really preaching the gospel of positivity. And that is a really great way to leave that legacy, is to just put the world on that positive swing. So when I think about my own personal legacy, I think about what can I do to leave the world better than how I found it, for my children, for my friends. So I love that.
Yeah, I just look, again, going back to the present moment. That's all we have. I mean, we can dwell in the past, but that's in the present moment. We can worry about the future, but that's in the present moment. So obviously approaching the biggie, when I go, I'm going to go, and so on and so forth. But I will still be left in other people's present moments with their memories of how I've interacted with them and so on and so forth. Just like all of the loved ones that I've lost are there in my present moment too. That's what it's all about. It's not about legacy or anything like that. It's just the being that I am, that I will always be with them, whether I'm physically here or not.
Beautiful. So when we think about our legacy or lack thereof, and we think about, the practical components of it, the planning, there's a new trend out there where people are writing their own obituaries. Is that something that you would do? Would you write your own obituary? And if you would you want it to be serious? Would you want it to be funny? Would you, want your personality to shine through? What would you want?
I'll weigh in on that one. This is not new, okay?
Well, it's
But
becoming more popular and mainstreamed. Let me rephrase.
What I'm basically saying to you, everything old is new again, okay? There was this man who lived in the 1800s, actually was born in the 1800s. His name was Napoleon Hill. And one of his recommendations was, when you set out into the world and decide what you're going to end up as, and then he's been shamelessly stolen from. He stole it from other people. You know, nobody has any new ideas. Let's put it that way. We may forget to attribute them, but I actually, back in the 1990s, when I first started coaching people about life goals and that sort of thing, I would have them sit down and we'd have a conversation and we'd say, well, you want to live your life so that when you pass away, even the undertaker is sorry. Okay. Somebody who never knew you, you know, is living what a great person you were through the grief of other people that are around. And so the whole idea was, you know, write the obituary that explains what you did in the world and how it makes a difference to who you are now before you did any of these things. So however they're doing it these days, the technique of beginning with the end in mind, as Mr. Covey says, the best way to go about doing that is to you know, codify it in language. And when you were talking about before, the feeling, I have the same relationship about what I'm going to leave behind as I do about, you know, experiencing in the present, as Chip said, because this is all we get. We can spend this time doing that, or we can spend it, you know, doing something really powerful with people. But I have the same relationship with what am I going to leave behind as I do with what's my death going to be like, you know? No, I'm still a kid in that area in terms, and I don't have a lot of interest to get good at that, to be honest with you.
That's my job.
It's more for me, and I will share something with you because I know nobody else, this will be our little secret. Nobody else is ever going to hear this. Okay. But I've
Eric, make sure you edit that out.
Right, no,
gone through my adult life.
We'll just remind the audience, don't tell anybody what you're about to hear.
You're all sworn to secrecy. If you hear this, just keep it to yourself because it's really not all that interesting anyway. But I have gone through, I don't know, 15 different types of building projects over my career, including ones for a corporation, Salvation Army building that we did, the Frog Bridge here in Willimantic. You now know that I was on those committees. I had my opportunity to have my name associated with all of those things and put in a bronze plaque. And I absolutely refused. It wasn't important to me that my name be another person who I saw who lived in the 1800s or early 1900s. I had no idea who the hell they were. Now, I will want it to be on my tombstone. And I will want people to walk by and read it and say it out loud. Because even if they don't relate that to me, I will know that somebody is still getting value out of saying the words aloud. So with that said, the other part of what I heard you ask and say is, I'm probably making this up. I don't know personally if I find it valuable to spend much time thinking about those things from the standpoint, it's more like daydreaming when I was a kid, if you will, as opposed to writing my goals out, choosing the people that I'm going to have meetings with this week. And at some point, it just changed in my body. It became more important for me to plant trees, knowing that I'd never sit under them, than to go around convincing people that I planted those trees. And I don't know if that communicates, but that's
the back to the choice and the presence. Yeah, it's the choice and the presence and the, you know, not worrying about those nitty gritties because you don't have to worry about the future because you're in the present. I can resonate with that. I think that there is, you know, things to be considered. I think I want to make sure that I express the importance of like end of life planning, estate planning, take care of the red tape so your family doesn't have to, because, you know, that's bereavement, not grief. in terms of our own mortality and that juggling and struggling with those abstract concepts, it might be less about understanding it and labeling it and more about the presence of the now and the how we live and the positivity we put into the world. And that makes those easier and palatable. We're able to have those conversations with others because we're less focused on the what and we're more focused on the who. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm gonna have to bail to something else right at the moment. And before I go, I would like to just summarize, if that's okay, in my, from my perspective.
Absolutely.
I think that people typically are engaged in the conversation that's going on. It's either the one they started or the one they've been invited to. And I think this conversation about understanding the unknowable and ununderstandable is where you start to get handles on those distinctions. And I think being in a position where you can return to being powerful from being completely taken offline, especially in this area of grief, I think it's an extremely important conversation for people to kind of muck around with and get out on the skinny branches and try to figure out, if there is something to figure out that will at least allow them, a short trip back to grace, if you will, as opposed to it lasts as long as it lasts. Because in my opinion, power is when you're able to be functioning and and focus, and being unpowerful is a state of mind that most people will want to spend as little time. If you choose to be in that state, more power to you. However, resisting it and fighting it is different than making a choice to get back on the horse and let it throw you again.
The only way out is through.
Yep.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. And that's a beautiful segue into me asking the remaining panelists, what's a piece of advice that you want to give your friends, your family, your sphere to help understand or ease the grieving process? Anybody?
Yeah, I guess I can go. I think for me, one of the greatest gifts I gave myself when my dad passed was practicing compassion to myself. Like really allowing myself, whatever I felt. I didn't judge it. I didn't label it. I was kind of like, this is how I feel right now. And it was the greatest gift I gave myself because there was no pressure. Like I didn't pressure myself in any way to go through it faster, to go through it in any particular way, to do anything specific. I was like, whatever's going to make, if I feel this now, I feel this now. And whatever I need to help me through that, that's what I'll do. And that's fine.
Beautiful. So sharing that with your sphere and having them give that same compassion and just allowing would be a good piece of advice.
Yeah, just allowing, and no, really that whole idea of non-judgment. Like, don't judge yourself nor anyone else. Like, it's not my place anyway, but people are always quick to judge. And I was like, no judgment zone.
Yeah, I think it's important that you have to do what you need to do. I mean, sometimes it's, taking the time to really grieve and wallow. And sometimes it's, doing something completely normal. I remember after my mother passed away, I didn't have a suit for her funeral. So I had to run out and I had to buy a suit. And I went out, we got the suit, had to be tailored, fixed up. Usually that takes like, a week or two. And they, but they knew what was going on, so they did it right away. And they said, well, come back in 3 hours. We'll have it for you. And for those 3 hours, my wife and I went out to lunch. We walked around Manhattan. And it was the first time since she had passed that I just felt normal. And that felt so good to just be normal for a little while. And I think that's something that, no two people grieve in the same way. You sort of have to figure out what you need to get through it. And sometimes it's, facing it head on and dealing with it. And sometimes it's getting back and feeling normal for a little bit. And sometimes it's a combination of those things or other things.
Yeah. And giving yourself permission and not feeling guilty. I remember very specifically after Craig passed away, I went, and I was hanging out with a friend and I found myself like laughing and joking and I stopped and I was like, oh my God, like, and they had to remind me, like, it's okay to laugh. It's okay to experience joy and to feel happiness. Just because you're still grieving and you're sad doesn't mean you have to live in that space in perpetuity. So give yourself permission to do what you need to do to experience normalcy or joy or those things that help the process move organically. Chip, what about you? I'd love some feedback from you.
Yeah, I love the words allow. I love the words self-compassion. There is no book out there with how you're supposed to feel, what you're supposed to do, and anything like that. I mean, Eric, you did mention your experience. I mean, my experience when my father passed away, basically, he was diagnosed and was gone within a couple of weeks. And all of a sudden, I'm there with my sister and my mother. We go out to lunch and we're starting to plan the funeral process and so on and so forth. And it was kind of like the weight of the world lifting off our shoulders and then just getting back together again. And the neat thing about my mom, of course, even though she's only been gone for less than 2 years, it was at least 10 years ago that she took this book out that had all the instructions about how the funeral is going to be. She'd already set up with basically you talked a lot about planning, whatever. She had everything written there as far as who's going to, both of my sons one's going to play a sax, the other one's going to cantor. This is for the readings and so on and so forth. One of the things she said, you talked about eulogies, there will be no eulogy. So what happened is two of my sisters just got up there and they wrote their own things and they were just talking back and forth about what was going on because my mom she gave a whole lot in her life. I mean, she was a Eucharistic minister and did a whole bunch of things for soup kitchens and things like that. And she just had a heart of gold. And, but she didn't want anybody to, talk about that at all. And so they got up there and I looked up there and said, sorry, Mom, here it comes. But as far as the planning part of it, the wild thing was she always thought that that my father would outlive her because there's more longevity in the family. And then when he was gone, we were able to take all the plans for her funeral and use it for his in the first place. So we ran like a year, 2.5 years before it went. And it was perfect. So obviously, as far as yourself goes, self-compassion, just allowing it. But obviously for those of you out there, if you do a little planning, as you were saying, Kate, to take that burden off of people moving ahead. And Eric and I just both went through it as far as, executors for our mothers and so on and so forth and going through all that. And obviously that takes a little bit off of what we're going through because we're organizing all that stuff. And me having 6 siblings and a whole bunch of nieces and nephews and stuff like that, it kept me out of trouble as far as that goes too. But it's just understand there's no book, there's no right way, there's no wrong way. Just be true to yourself and understand that, that's what you're going through. And, most importantly, just feel the person that you lost because they're still there.
Absolutely. Yeah, they definitely are still there. And I think, I was going to ask you guys what makes for a good death, but I think it's more important to ask what makes for good grief. We've touched on that and how we change the dialogue in our society, in our culture, being authentically yourself and not being afraid to be compassionate to other people and to allow and give yourselves permission. So what advice do you have having gone through a grief experience? If you had something to do over, what would you do different? I guess that's how I should phrase that.
I don't know that I would do anything differently, but there are certain experiences that I think should definitely be replicated. When my father-in-law passed away, his funeral was hysterical because people just got up and told stories about him and told things about what he had done, what, and the one that stood out in my head is my father-in-law worked at Otis Elevator, and one of the projects he worked on was the elevator for the World Trade Center. And when the World Trade Center was still under construction, he took his son to the elevator and he told his son, look, this is what I'm working on. He goes, this is so smooth. He pulled a quarter out of his pocket and he said, I can put this quarter on its edge and we'll go up. It's not going to move. And he put the quarter on the floor and the elevator went all the way to the top. The quarter didn't move. It was still on the edge.
Wow.
For his son's 50th birthday, he finally told him, no, there was a little crack between the floorboards. I wedged it in there. But he kept the punchline of that for 40 years,
Goodness.
And they told that story and everybody's laughing and they're talking about all these things, And I think that's important. It's like, yes, you're going to miss these folks, but talk about what you're going to miss, because you're not going to miss the arguments. You're not going to miss the stubbornness. You're going to miss the jokes. You're going to miss the good times. And that's the stuff you need to talk about.
Mm.
And, and people need to realize that, yes, it's okay to laugh, even right at the funeral. And of course, Kate might be a little too young for this, but I'm sure Jan and Chip remember the Mary Tyler Moore show with the funeral of Chuckles the Clown.
I watched it in syndication,
Oh,
okay? Like,
it's...
I had Nick at night, okay?
But, it's okay to laugh.
It's actually healthy for you.
I think
I love that.
I think I was never sorry about, and if anything, might sound a little sappy, but I always thought to myself, like the whole idea that you can never tell someone you love them too much. And even though I said it often to my father, I sometimes will think to myself, I didn't even say it enough then. So it was this feeling that, so this whole idea of, those are the things that are important. And I love what Eric shared about, the stories, because that's what we did basically for that week in Shiva. When we sat around the whole family together for those 7 days, we were basically living together for the first, time since we were kids, my brother and their wives and whatever. And that's all we did was share stories about my dad, different, really funny stories.
And for the listeners who don't know, can you just give me a broad spectrum overview of what Shiva is?
Oh, sure. So in Judaism, after someone, you usually bury within 24 hours or less. And for the first 7 days, you sit in a house, preferably on lower chairs as a sign of mourning, and people come to visit you and acknowledge that person. And, it's a beautiful, beautiful practice. And I think I appreciated it more, having experienced it. I think a lot of the customs are really, really, and the laws surrounding death are really, really beautiful. And I don't think I'd never really looked into them that intricately, but it was, I find it very interesting. Like the laws in Judaism are different depending, like for my mother, because she lost a spouse, versus me because I lost a parent. Like the rules are different the first year,
Interesting.
you know, and everything. And so just how wise a lot of the customs were. Like there was a really great wisdom to everything that they, you know, they suggest, like they basically have people do. So that period when we were all together and we shared stories about my father, and some of it was the fact that my brother has 13 grandchildren.
Wow.
Yeah. So a lot of the kids were around, and because we didn't want them to like think of Shiva or death as a bad thing, we were very conscious of telling really happy, really funny stories about my dad
Mm.
that, you know, they could experience it and experience him, you know, through us. So that was very important to my, you know, to us as a family.
I can absolutely resonate with that. My daughter was 19 months old when my husband, her father, passed away. And so a lot of the Christmas traditions and Thanksgiving traditions and like even Craig's birthday, we bring out the photo albums and we turn on the movies and we tell the stories. And so for his birthday this year, we like recreated one of his favorite meals, and she's old enough now where she got to participate. And so it really that feels very much like its intention is to keep the spirit and the essence of their personality alive and going and give it that type of legacy. So I love that, and I would love to learn more about it in the future. And for the listeners, if you don't know about it, I would encourage you to go do your homework and learn how other cultures embrace grief and death and dying, because it is wildly different than how we do, and it might offer perspective and even comfort. Chip, what about you? Would you like to weigh in on what we're talking about here?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first few experiences that I had were grandparents dying out in Wisconsin. So, and I was like in my late teens, early 20s when we went out there, and the after parties, the lunches afterwards, especially on my mom's side of the family, because they're the crazy bunch. And father passed away, and basically my uncle, the one who was a teacher, was also a really great cook and bartender. So he was working at this bar, and that's where his funeral was afterwards. And the lunch, obviously, the stories about him were amazing. I mean, he used to be able to teach us how to swear in 5 different languages and a whole bunch of other different things. His name was Boppy, and we just, called him all these Boppy stories. And it was just so great, just reminiscing with my family about all that kind of stuff. And a really funny side is Nancy was kind of quiet back then, and we're driving down to Chicago to the airport, and my 3 youngest sisters, who are 4 years apart total, were in the back seat, kind of going crazy. Nancy's normally pretty quiet, and finally she had had enough, and so at the top of her lungs she yelled, "Children," like a mom, and there's silence in the back, and all of a sudden, just hysterical laughter the whole rest of the way down to the airport, because that was like her outcoming and so on. And here we are all these years later. But that's a moment that I'll never forget. And obviously, reminiscing about the stories. I mean, in my culture, obviously, you wait a few days, you have the showing, and then you have the funeral, and then you have like a lunch or something, get together afterwards. And those are always wonderful. And if you're out there, for a day or two afterwards, it's just so important to celebrate the lives and celebrate the people who are there, because we're all going through the same thing. And you got to have fun together, because that's what you had while that person was alive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it really is that celebration of life. And I think that becomes such a platitude and a label that we forget the essence of what that terminology was supposed to mean. That coming together, whether it be a Catholic funeral, a Christian, observance, a Shiva, whatever that, culturally significant way of memorializing the person is, the essence is to remember them, not just mourn them. So I would say for me personally, the greatest piece of advice that I can give people, both support persons and the ones experiencing grief, say their name. If you ask someone, how they're doing, and the lost loved one's name, use their name. And I want to offer you all the opportunity now to say your loved ones' names. If there's someone who's on your mind, who you've been thinking of as we've been having this discussion, I talk a lot about Craig, my husband. I also lost my grandmother, Eleanor. I was very close with her. It was my mom's mom. So those are 2 names that are very important to me that I say often. And I would love to hear the names of your loved ones if you'd like to share.
Yeah, my parents were Terry and Muriel.
Hmm.
Yeah. My parents were Eddie and Phyllis, and my in-laws were Alan and Doris.
I love it.
My dad was Herbert and Herb, and my grandmother, who I was very close to, who was Lillian.
Lillian. Mm.
She was we were best friends. I mean, I was really, really close with her.
I love it. I love it. Well, I want to thank you all. I know we're almost out of time. I think we've got a few minutes left, but I want to give it back to Eric, make sure that we wrap up anything we need to. But I really just want to thank you all for your participation, for your transparency, for your contribution to the global conversation around grief and helping me to change the landscape and create compassion in the world. So thank you, Eric, for this incredible opportunity to facilitate this conversation. If anyone out there would like more information or resources in terms of grief education and coaching, you can find me at my website. On Tuesdays, we wear black. That's my business name, www.otwwb.com. Where I do blog, I do interpersonal conversations, as well as business coaching for any organization out there needing support with their workers or their customers. And with that, Eric, I'll kick it back over to you to tie things up.
All right. Well, thank you so much for facilitating this, Kate. And thanks to all of our participants for being so open and willing to participate in what is a really difficult conversation. I hope our listeners have benefited from this. And you can hear this as part of Lighting the Candle, as well as the Success Showcase. And we will see you all in our next episodes. So thanks for listening.